Good evening, friends and comrades, and welcome to the Medway Trades Union Council Workers' Memorial Day event. The main purpose of which is to commemorate those who have lost their lives whilst at work or as a result of their work. This is clearly even more poignant this year with the COVID-19 pandemic gripping the world and affecting all our lives in some way or another. So the event will follow a plan which will start with Brother Ralph Tebbett reading the roll of commemoration, which will list those we know if that have died over the last year, including the key workers who've lost their lives while fighting the outbreak on the front line. At the end of the roll call, we'll hold a short silence. It won't be a full minute, but it will be a short silence. As a mark of condolence for the loved ones they left behind. So after this gesture of solidarity, we will move on to an extra speaker, not listed in the publicity, Brother Kevin Woods from Unite the Union. Hopefully he'll be here shortly. He will be speaking about the refuse collectors dispute in Medway. There's a little bit on our Facebook page already about a flash demo that we did this morning at their depot. So we will then move on to our two key speakers of the evening, starting with Sister Louise Raw and then Sister Jackie Berry. There will be an opportunity to ask some questions at the end of the presentations. Then finally a brief summing up with a poignant piece of poetry from musician and socialist campaigner Brother Joe Solo before closing. If you do have any questions, put them in the comments section below the Facebook post, and our two invigilators, Brother Steve Wilkins and Brother Chaz Berry, will then pick those up at random to ask when the two speakers have finished. I hope you enjoy the evening, and thanks again for joining us. It's not the same as meeting comrades face to face, I know that, but we do live in interesting times and we have to adapt and learn as we always have done in the labour movement. I'm now going to hand over to Brother Ralph Tebbett for the roll of commemoration. Ralph, away you go.
Friends and comrades, I ask you now to honour those who have died whilst in work or as a result of the work they do. Around 150 people die each year in the UK alone as a result of their going to work. All work has dignity, but we are still a long way away from a time when brothers and sisters can go to work with the expectation that they will return home safely to their loved ones and friends. This year, of course, there will be many, many more as a result of COVID-19 pandemic, with almost 100 key workers already and between 21,000 and 40,000 other deaths already recorded. Let us use this moment to remind ourselves that our work will never be done until we are done ourselves. Let us pledge again that as long as we may, we will remember the dead and fight for the living together in unity. Those we list here this year are not all those who have died, but those whom we have been told about. So if you know yourself, someone else, please hold them on your mind too, as we show our solidarity as we remember them. We remember Jill Kennard, a campaigner and a political activist. Ian Drew, railway conductor and RMT member. Gailey Katala, nurse from Maidstone. Amy O'Rourke, nurse at QEQM Hospital. Vivek Sharma, occupational therapist at MCH. Derek Barr, Strood Mail Delivery Centre. Barbara Sage, Marie Curie nurse at Bromley. Sisters and brothers, we remember you and will honour you by fighting for those who you leave behind. For now we offer you our solidarity as we take some time in silent contemplation.
Thank you, Ralph, for your inspiring words. May we all take them to heart and fight for the living when we go home from this place. Obviously, we are in our homes, most of us anyway. So I've now got great pleasure in introducing our first keynote speaker this evening, Sister Louise Raw, who is a committed trade unionist and campaigner for the Labour movement, as well as being an author of the renowned book Striking a Light, which gives a real insight into the match women's strike of 1898, I believe, which was a seminal moment in not just industrial relations, but the recognition of women workers as an integral part of the labour movement and the trade union movement. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Ivor, and thanks for asking me. It's really nice to virtually be here with everybody. I suppose the only positive thing about this Workers' Memorial Day is I normally have to say to people, no, honestly, we're not living in a world of health and safety gone mad, because that's still a narrative, isn't it, from the right-wing press particularly. No, honestly, workers are dying out there. This year, we haven't got to convince anybody of that, have we? But sadly so. I've never done so much angry crying myself as I'm doing now, just with watching the deaths of key line workers and with what I'm hearing from my friends who are in the NHS too. I mean, the Panorama programme last night, I don't know if anyone saw it, should, in decent times, that would be the end of this government, wouldn't it? But it's still happening. I'm still talking to nurses. A friend of mine who's a nurse just today has been exposed because she was told to treat a supposedly non-COVID patient with no PPE because they're rationing PPE. She's now been told, oh, actually, he's been tested for it. So she's got to wait and see if she's been exposed to it. And this is happening everywhere. It's happening all over the country. And as a historian of the labour movement, you're always interested to get in touch with the past, but I don't know that I really want to see 1888 playing out in front of my eyes, because that's what it feels like. We are right back there. This government has taken us right back there. The match women in Bow who went on strike in 1888 were being exposed to extremely dangerous working conditions, just like frontline workers now. Their management knew they were, but they weren't bothered about it. Sounds familiar too, doesn't it? They didn't have protective equipment that they should have had and could have had. And their management, their bosses at Bryant and May at the match factory, sacked them for talking to the press. And again, that's exactly what's happening, isn't it? I put a nurse in touch with the Panorama team for this program, and I had to do it like some sort of spy mission. It had to be done so secretly because her management are telling her, if you talk to the press, you're sacked. Management are even coming on and stopping their WhatsApp groups. And I don't think any of us doubt that if they could stop them being in trade unions, just like in 1888, they would do that too. And that's what the match women faced. They had no trade union. They were working with white phosphorus, an absolutely horrendous chemical. Some of you may know that now it's banned as a weapon of war, but it was fine for working class teenage girls, mostly as the match women were in the East End of London, to be dipping match splints into this disgusting toxic chemical. And how toxic was it? Well, it was so flammable, white phosphorus, that it had to be kept permanently in water. It would just burst into flames. If you have white phosphorus and it gets hot, just naturally hot, the room temperature gets hot, it'll burst into flames. It would make you, exposure to it would make you vomit almost immediately, just exposure to the fumes. It could make you pass out. It could make you glow. It could make your skin glow. That's how deadly it was, and make your clothes glow. And for the match women, I was told when I was giving a talk a few years ago by grandchildren of people who lived near the match factory in Bow in East London. They said that their grandparents told them they would see pools of fluorescing vomit all the way home that marked the match girls' route home from the factory. That's how disgusting and toxic this was. Well, let's look at Bryant and May. They were an extremely affluent firm. They were very well in with the government. They were dining with prime ministers. So people believed they would be treating their employees well, because my God, they had done well. In one generation, they'd gone from being grocers, from shop owners, to the Bryant sons who were in charge in the 1880s, owning these massive country estates. And how had they done it? Well, they'd done it at the expense of their workers. But Bryant and May said they knew nothing about this disease, the necrosis that white phosphorus called, which the match women called phossy jaw, or the phos. It was technically known as phosphorus necrosis. What it actually did was decay your bones while you were still alive. So you're alive, your bones are decaying from the inside out. Just absolutely horrendous. And Bryant and May denied knowing anything about it, as employers do today. Oh, everything's fine here, we have no problems in our factory. But I found, from looking at the archives with my trade union head on, this is my advantage as a historian, was I wasn't an academic historian, I was a trade unionist who became a historian, that actually the disease was well known. Phossy jaw was well known from the 1850s. Everybody knew about it. They knew about it very well. But what they used to do, rather than look after workers, which, you know, that's kind of expensive, isn't it, looking after workers, what's a lot cheaper? Sacking them if you think they're coming down with it. So women that looked like they were developing phossy jaw and your jaw would swell were sacked. So they used to disguise the early signs of it with scarves. And you would think, well, why would they do that? Because you died quite slowly from phossy jaw, but you died very quickly of starvation. And those were your alternatives in the 1880s, when you had no trade union and no contract of employment whatsoever. So what happened with phosphorus necrosis was that it was completely avoidable. There's the most frustrating thing. You could use red phosphorus, which was not toxic, was completely safe for workers, but it was more expensive. So why would Bryant and May bother? Yes, okay, they were making the equivalent of millions themselves, but you know, you want to pay your shareholders, don't you? So you don't want to be using expensive products. So they carried on using it. And what made matters worse was they should have provided the match women with a separate dining room. Matchworking was classed as a dangerous trade, so you weren't supposed to be eating in the fumes of phosphorus. But again, that's expensive. Why would you bother? So the match girls would bring in from home their lunch, which would just be a bit of bread, probably quite stale. Girls in those days, working class people, lived on bread, butter if they were lucky, but probably just stale bread, and tea, again, if you were lucky. That was what you ate day in, day out. Vegetables and fruit, forget about it, meat, and very special occasions. So the women come into this huge factory, they have their bit of bread, they lay it on their workbench until they get a chance to eat it. White phosphorus is in the air. So you can imagine what's happening. The particles are settling on your lunch like a poisonous seasoning. So you come to eat it, it's got an easy route into your jaw, particularly because in those days you're likely to have missing teeth. You can't afford the dentist in those days. So really easy for this poison to get into your jawbone. And from there on in, it is just horrific. Your bone starts to decay, abscesses develop, and there's talk, I'm sorry if anybody's just had supper, but there's talk of workers spitting out bits of bone the size of peas. Just constantly this bone is breaking down. And I think the saddest thing about that is that family members couldn't stand to have sufferers living under the same roof as them because of the smell. The smell was so awful that factory inspectors later will find match workers living sort of on the outskirts of towns and cities, almost like lepers. And that sounds really cruel on behalf of their families, but you have to remember they were probably living 10 people to a room, and really to a room, really one room where everyone's working and sleeping and eating. So having somebody really, really ill and this terrible odour was just unbearable for them. So horrible disease, completely avoidable. But Bryant and May would just sack people so they weren't on the record, so that factory inspectors couldn't record them. And I found that as well. I looked at Bryant and May speaking to various inquiries where the deference to them was quite incredible. The parliamentary inquiries sort of saying, oh, sir, you know, Mr. Bryant, how wonderful of you to join us, sir, and we're so honoured to have you here. Do you have any fossijor in your factory? Oh, absolutely not. That's more in the poorer sort of places. We wouldn't have that here. Oh, thank you, sir. Absolutely. Very pleased to have you. And that, you know, there was no kind of rigour whatsoever. The word of gentleman was accepted over the word of common working people because, my goodness, they don't tell the truth, do they? You can't rely on them. So it wasn't until a journalist called Annie Besant wrote about fossijor, amongst other things. She happened to hear at a Fabian meeting, a socialist meeting, that match women were being exploited, went to talk to a few of them. Her intention was to expose Bryant and May and perhaps get a boycott of Bryant and May products. And she wrote about fossijor. Bryant and May, furious, absolutely furious, because very much like a modern company, they really had regard for their public relations. They loved to do, you know, talk about how wonderful conditions were in the factory. Really angry that Annie Besant published this piece. So what they tried to do, I mean, it's what employers try to do now. They tried to intimidate the workers. They tried to get the match women to sign a statement saying this journalist has lied. You know, we're all so happy working for Bryant and May. It's wonderful. We're so well looked after. And they refused to do it, which is incredible. Thousands of women working in this factory site in Fairfield Road. They all knew they would be sacked just like that. They were sacked for the slightest thing. They had no employment rights whatsoever. They all refused to sign this paper. And we know why they did it. It's a really rare example of their words verifiable that I was ever able to find in all my years of research, because nobody wrote down the opinions of working class Irish, good grief, you know, poor East End women. Who wants to know what they think, if indeed they even do think? But they put a letter through Annie Besant's door and they said, we're being pressured to betray you, basically, to go back on you, and we will not do that, because what you've spoken is quite true. We hope that you do not get into any trouble on our behalf, which is really touching, I think. Annie Besant could look after herself. She was a middle-class woman. They knew they risked being sacked immediately, but they wouldn't. They understood solidarity and they had integrity. A journalist has spoken the truth. She's done it for us. We won't go back on her. So the next thing Bryant and May do, that bit of intimidation hasn't worked, is they sack one girl who they believe has spoken to Annie Besant. And, you know, you see the parallels in what's happening in the NHS. Nurses, I know, are being told, if you speak to the press, if you even post on Twitter about the reality of what's happening, your job is at risk. So 132 years later, here we are again. Bryant and May sacked one girl, but they underestimated their workforce massively, because what happened then was that the girls all saw what had happened. They laid down their tools, they left their workbenches, they streamed out of this massive factory site, out of the gates, onto Fairfield Road and out onto the Bow Road. They were amazing operators, actually. They'd been on strike before and they really knew what they were doing. That's not what we've been told. We've been told that Annie Besant and the middle classes organised their strike, led their strike, you know, set up the whole strike. Completely untrue. Nobody was there. The walkout was completely spontaneous. It was only the working class women. Annie Besant was nowhere around. They quickly had a little vote, selected some people to represent them. Those women went back into Bryant and May and said, right, this is what we want. Here are our terms. And not just the reinstatement of the girl that you've sacked, we want the right to form a trade union. Immediately, that was their demand. And Bryant and May, well, I can't imagine what their language was, but they would have been furious. You know, how dare these common, rough set of girls, as they called them, these rough Irish girls who are probably Fenian terrorists, they all are, how dare they try telling us, you know, respectable gentlemen, what to do? So they told them to do one, basically, and said, we're not listening to you. You're all sacked. Even if you come back now, you're all sacked. So the women said, right, fair enough. And they went out. And in those days, without your Twitter or your Facebook, how did you let people know what was happening? How did you get the publicity out there about what you were doing? Well, they were so smart. They knew that they didn't have power in the conventional sense. They were supposed to be powerless, no trade union, no access to the press, no voice really. But they knew they had numbers. So what they did was to march all around the streets of the East End and the Bow Road, making a lot of noise and singing rude songs about Bryant and May, by the way, and exactly what they'd like to do to their employers. And people would come out of their houses and look out of their windows and call down, "What on earth are you lot doing down there? What's all this racket?" And they say, "Well, we're the Match Women," which actually people probably knew because they were a very well-known group in the area. "And we're on strike, and here's why." And people threw down coins, which they would catch in their aprons. They had these long aprons they wore to work, and they would catch the money, and that was their strike funds. That was how they set up their strike fund. Completely on their own, no middle-class people anywhere near. Few days until they went to Annie Besant and said, "Oh, sorry to trouble you, but we're on strike." And her reaction was, "Who on earth are you?" basically. So she had no idea the strike had taken place. It's wrong to say she was a strike leader. That's what my book and all my research was about. And it matters. It's really important, because British history likes to defer to this idea that, you know, the workers are a faceless, voiceless mass, and they're completely, you know, they're not really political. They need the middle classes to tell them what to do. You know, we need Keir Starmer, don't we, to organise for us. We don't want, you know, the grassroots rebelling. It's really noticeable how few people are actually going to talk. The media are not going to talk to nurses, are they? They're telling us what they think is happening in hospitals. They're not asking key workers. They're not really interviewing trade unionists. Good grief, we don't want them near the telly. So it's really important to understand that even in 1888, these women were brilliant political operators. They knew they were exploited. They might not have been able to read Karl Marx cover to cover, or even to read, but, you know, your jaw rotting and you and your family starving is a bit of a hint that you're being exploited. You don't need middle class people to tell you. So what the Match Women did was incredible. Not by any means the first strike by working people, but the first huge victory over a really powerful employer. In 2 weeks, they met with MPs. That was extraordinary in itself. A middle-class gentleman meeting on equal terms with a working-class matchwoman. My God, that would never happen in those days. And the MPs were amazed. You know, they'd heard that this was a rabble, and they said things like, "Oh, these women were very eloquent. Good God, they could form whole sentences." You know, who knew that working class people could do that? So they really represented themselves well. Eventually, Bryant and May had to give in, not because they had a change of heart and they suddenly became lovely, caring employers, because share prices tumbled, good old capitalism, and because they got put under immense pressure from the press, from the media. Their shareholders were often liberal MPs and clergymen, and that was very embarrassing. There you are in your day job saying we must care about the poor, but there you are being exposed in the newspapers as making 20% dividends, 20% profits on your shares at the expense of women in the East End having their jaws rotted. So it's very embarrassing. So as today, this is what's important: getting our stories out there, getting our voices heard, putting pressure, speaking truth unto power. Not very easy with our media nowadays, but it's the only way. We have to do it. So Bryant and May had to cave. They were absolutely furious at having to do it. They were furious for decades afterwards, by the way, about this strike, and still trying in the 1960s to disassociate themselves from it and to say, well, conditions weren't really that bad. Their archives are quite hilarious from that point of view. But they were forced to give in to all the women's demands. The women walked back to work triumphant in only around 2 weeks, which is amazing. They formed the largest union of women and girls in the country at the time. It's a magnificent achievement. They got better rates of pay, better conditions, and they got their separate dining room as well. They really were an extraordinary bunch of women. And it's not, unfortunately, just a story of the past that is not relevant to us now. We are pretty much going backwards thanks to our government. And I have no doubt that they would return us to a place where we didn't have trade unions if they got half a chance. So we need to remember stories like this. And we need to remember what it's like without trade unions. Because we're told, aren't we, that, oh, without trade unions interfering, the wealth creators will create the wealth and it'll trickle down and everything will be marvellous. Trade unions spoil it. Well, there's your reality. Just look at what the match women had without trade unions. They were dying and they were starving. And, you know, I have no doubt that we'll be back there unless we're very careful and keep fighting for the rights that people like that won for us. Thank you.
Okay, so now I'd like to introduce Brother Kevin Woods from the Unite the Union to talk about the issue of the PPE and the refuse workers based in Gillingham for Medway.
Hi, how you going?
Hi, thanks for that. Cheers.
Nice. Evening, guys. Thanks very much for joining us. My name's Kev Woods. I'm a Unite convener at Medway North. Firstly, I'd like to thank Steve and all of the guys from the TUC for popping down on a horrible rainy morning to perform a nice picket outside our yard. Just want to take up a couple of minutes of your time to talk about the current dispute that we have within Medway. We have obviously all of the bin services, domestic refuse, street cleansers, grounds teams, and some other workers throughout Medway North. As the process of COVID-19 unfolded, we basically approached Medway North and asked some legitimate concerns of the company. Once all the government legislation came out in relation to social distancing and other bits and pieces, again, the natural follow-on from us was to talk that through, or attempt to talk that through with the company. So social distancing was a big issue for us. Things like PPE, hand sanitizer, access to toilets, because obviously we work on the road, and in effect, Medway Council had instructed Medway North to close all the public toilets, and we use those facilities. So because our guys are out pretty much all day, we need usage of those. Things like alcohol hand sanitizers. We had hand sanitizing towels, but it didn't have an alcohol content. And a few other general bits and pieces, which obviously we wanted consultation. You know, we wanted a thought in the processes going forward. As a result of the concerns that we raised initially, through both ourselves, myself, Chris, and the regional officer from Unite, what basically happened was a little bit draconian. So they pretty much turned around and de-recognised immediately Unite as the union of Medway North. Bearing in mind that we have the majority of members throughout the workforce, and we've been part of a 2P process, and Unite has been in place for the last 7 years on these particular contracts.
Kevin, I'm afraid, is not able to log back in. He's got some problems. His colleague, Chris Barnard's also in the meeting, so I'm going to ask him just to finish off on what Kevin was saying very briefly. So over to you, Chris.
Hi, everyone. Chris Barnard, I'm a fellow trade unionist at North, as Kevin was saying. We haven't taken this lightly. We started off, when this all started, asking for risk assessments. Fellow colleagues and stuff have been put onto sick leave at the current time instead of being furloughed through ill health. This is something we're still looking at to try and come to an agreement with the employer to sort, but currently being de-recognised has just chucked a massive spanner into the works. Social distancing, as Kevin was saying, is a massive issue for us. We're put into some into free in a cab as pictures depicted this morning from your guys on the ground that did the picket for us. Hand sanitizer only just come in the last maybe week to 2 weeks, after possibility of about 4 weeks of asking for this. Kevin was saying the toilets were previously locked. This was only sorted when we rang this up, saying that inadequate facilities on the ground for the guys on the ground, such as street cleansers, dustmen, the dustbin women that we have on our crew as well. This is the basics of hygiene that we're asking for. You know, and who is a company to dictate our safety? We come to work because we have to, and you know, we have to pay our bills. We still have that element of enjoyment to our work. We may be sinners, maybe low in society by some, but without us, there would be so much disease on the streets. Look at Brighton Binman, for example, when they did their strike. I think it's about 2 years roughly now. The momentum that was behind them when they took that action against their employer. You know, this is the sort of things that may happen in Medway. People just sort of looking around. It would be chaotic. The employers, we hope, do come to the table and now look to re-recognise Unite as the union that their employees do want to have. We really are hoping that this will happen before industrial action comes to the forefront. A mandate for this is underway at the moment, so time will only tell, and hopefully the right decisions will be made. It really is a trying time for everybody, and we are, as workers, so you know, we really are trying our best. And like you said earlier, colleagues across Medway and further afield are dying. When does safety become for everybody and not just for who they deem it necessary? PPE should be given. You know, it's Dickensian. I understand there's costs, but as a health and safety director at HSE, you know, health and safety is everybody's lookout. You know, it's not just the employer, it's everybody. We should all be doing our part where we can, and some of us are. You know, we've had to purchase face masks at a low sort of dust mask standard, and it is difficult times. It really is. We just hope that things can be resolved before we have to go into industrial action. You know, I as a trade unionist, I don't take strike action lightly, and this could be a trying time. So I thank you guys, and support where it's needed will be given by, and we stand together in solidarity. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Chris. And obviously, please take back a message of solidarity from all of us here this evening at this Workers' Memorial event.
First of all, thank you, Ivor and the Trades Council, for putting on this event for Workers' Memorial Day. My name's Jackie Berry. I'm an intensive care nurse, and I'm a member of the National Executive Committee of Unison. But everything I say this evening is in my personal capacity as a trade unionist, and not necessarily the views of Unison or my employer. I think it's really important that organisations, trade union organisations, continue to commemorate International Workers' Memorial Day. It's been going for 31 years now, and I feel like every year trade unionists get together and solemnly swear to remember the dead and fight for the living, and then every year nothing much happens. Okay, you're not going to die in a mining accident anymore, but that's because there aren't any mines. And the conditions that lead to deaths at work, and beyond that, deaths because of work, something that the early socialist Frederick Engels called social murder, have intensified year on year over the last 3 decades. In fact, it's no coincidence that the theme of this year's International Workers' Memorial Day, before the COVID crisis took effect, was around mental health and looking at work-related stress and suicides. And that's because the psychological conditions before the coronavirus outbreak were already becoming increasingly intolerable for millions of workers around the world. And actually it's particularly the case for nurses in Britain. I did a piece of research myself last year about nurses' mental health and mental well-being. One nurse every 10 days on average commits suicide in Britain. In fact, nurses are the only group of women that are more likely to commit suicide than men. And I think it's worth asking ourselves why that might be before we sort of get into the situation today, because actually what was happening before the coronavirus outbreak took place is that our National Health Service was chronically underfunded, not just by the current Tory government, but by successive governments that had all sought to restructure and open the NHS up for more and more private sector involvement. And there were 100,000 vacancies in NHS England alone. 44,000 of those were in nursing and midwifery. This was exacerbated by the decision of the government, the Tory government, to get rid of the NHS bursary, and it was also further compounded by some changes that they made to English language requirements for overseas nurses, which put a lot of people off from coming. So nurses and healthcare assistants increasingly were holding together services which were dramatically understaffed and underfunded and coming under increasing pressure. And so that there was already a huge strain that was put upon that group of workers. It's no coincidence that the first healthcare worker to die during the COVID outbreak was a nurse at King's College Hospital who died on shift at work by suicide, because actually the conditions of looking after people who are unwell with coronavirus are incredibly difficult working conditions. Either you have the situation where you can't get access to the PPE that you know that you need in order to do your job safely, which is a source of huge anxiety, or you do have access to the PPE that you need, but wearing PPE is incredibly uncomfortable. It's hot, it's heavy, you wear a mask which breaks the skin down on your face. In fact, you might be able to see my nose and my cheeks are not normally this red because of the mask. Because you can't breathe properly, you end up with a lot of CO2 in your blood, which can cause headaches, confusion, agitation. If you wear the mask for too long, it can cause nausea, vomiting, and actually a lot of people up and down the country are wearing masks for sustained periods of time because people are rationing access to PPE. So the mental health effects on us are quite profound at the moment. But actually, I think after this, as this goes on, the impact on the mental health of the staff who are dealing with it on the front line will become more and more apparent. And there is a need, I think, for trade unionists to help organise healthcare workers to externalise the trauma that they're exposed to every single day. Because the alternative is that people internalise it, and when people internalise the trauma of the outside world, that's when they become mentally unwell. But actually, trade unions have got a responsibility to assist in these workers organising themselves. First and foremost on the pressing issue of access to PPE. I'm sure everybody by now has had a chance to watch the Panorama documentary from last night, and what's taken place in Britain is a national scandal, but actually it's mirrored across the world, because ultimately PPE, like all goods in a capitalist society, are produced on the basis that people are going to make profit out of them. So it's produced in this really chaotic, unplanned way, which means that in the event of a pandemic, there isn't enough to meet the demand. And what it also means is that products get bought up by people who are going to be the highest bidders and don't necessarily get to the places where they need to be the most. We need to support workers who exercise their legal rights to refuse to undertake a dangerous order on the part of their employer. And in some cases, that will mean workers, well, in worst case scenario, last resort cases, that could mean some workers are unable to provide healthcare for people with coronavirus if they don't have access to PPE. Because if healthcare workers provide healthcare to people without the PPE, then risk exposure themselves. If they become sick, there's then nobody left to look after the next set of patients. We have already seen over 100 healthcare workers in Britain die of coronavirus. And that's with quite severe underreporting and a reluctance on the part of the government to acknowledge care workers in particular as on the front line of this crisis. And you can already see the start of a legal wrangling developing between NHS employers, well, not just NHS, but sort of healthcare employers, who are saying, well, you know, we did our best, we followed Public Health England guidelines, but we couldn't get what we were asking for. You've got the government saying, don't blame us, you just follow the science, just do what the science says. So there's already the start of a legal blame game, which I think is not going to last months, it's going to last years to decades. But ultimately, the blame ultimately lies with the fact that these products are made and distributed on the basis of a free market system, which means that you can't plan it, you can't put it where you need it to be. If the government was serious about protecting every healthcare worker and every recipient of healthcare, then they would requisition factories and put into place sort of publicly owned social production of PPE, of personal protective equipment. But they won't do that. And the reason they don't want to do that is because they don't want to have a conflict with businesses that have got profits to be made. But ultimately, if we're talking about remembering the dead and fighting for the living, we need to ask ourselves, what is it that the living need? Well, first of all, the living need to not become the dead in the not too distant future. So PPE is an incredibly urgent demand that needs to be made on government and needs to be made on employers. There's also the issue of testing, and there have been huge problems in the testing process. The fact now that there's now tests, people can do home tests, they've run out in a day because they've distributed it on the basis of a first come first serve music concert rather than on the basis of a public health emergency. I don't think that we can have any confidence in the Tory government to protect the lives and health and safety of healthcare workers and wider society. I think we have limited confidence, by the way, in an opposition that seems to be obsessed with the idea of reopening schools, which serve as nothing more than petri dishes for super spreaders of the coronavirus. In the more immediate term, short to immediate term, there's the issue of pay. Healthcare workers have seen a reduction in the value of their salaries of 14% in the last 10 years. We're now, most of us, doing jobs that we didn't sign up for, and we're being exposed to severe hazards in the process. So we need to look at the issue of hazard pay, but we also need to look at the issue of upbanding everybody, because people who were doing one job a few weeks ago are now doing something very different and something noticeably a lot more taxing. We need to look at the issue of NHS funding and social care funding, and the fact that our social care system is like the Wild West of welfare services, where you've got thousands of different care providers all competing for PPE, which is exacerbating the PPE problem. But also, it's a market that doesn't work. It's a market that isn't providing a good standard of care in a systematic and consistent way. We need to bring social care into public ownership, and whether we do that on the basis of a national care service, or whether it's more looking at having it under local authority control, I think is a debatable question. The point is that it needs to be in public hands, and it needs to be under the control and management of the care workers who are already doing that job. And I think the same actually is true of NHS supplies. It's not just PPE that there have been shortages of. If you go onto the NHS supply chain website, there is a well-documented list of all things that are run into short supply, and I think there's plenty more on top of that. Believe you me, the resolution to these problems hasn't come from businesses being dynamic and forthcoming in resolving shortages. The resolution to these problems has come from the workers on the ground taking matters into their own hands, quite frankly. And why shouldn't they, when they're the ones that are already doing the work themselves? It seems madness that essential medical supplies are down to private companies to decide whether or not they're going to make profits out of it from one week to the next. We need a part of the NHS that focuses, that produces and distributes essential medical supplies, whether that's wet wipes, whether that's PPE, whether that's ventilators. They're all essential pieces of equipment in providing healthcare to people, and that should also be under the control of the workers who already provide those services. I think as well, when it comes to the question about when do we de-escalate the restrictions on like social distancing, when do we start opening things back up? Because already noticed in the last couple of days, people in the news, people in business, people in government are talking about it like it's a past tense thing, that we've passed the peak and it's all downhill from here. We don't know whether we've passed the peak. We won't know whether we've passed the peak until quite a way after it. But actually, just because you've passed the peak, that doesn't mean that all's cool. That doesn't mean that coronavirus no longer exists. That doesn't mean actually that critical care units up and down the country aren't working incredibly hard to get people over coronavirus. So we're in no way out of the woods, but already big business is starting to demand a reopening of basically like commercial life to try and get their profits rolling back in. Actually, it shouldn't be down to them. It shouldn't be down to whether or not Mr. Wetherspoon thinks that we should be going back to his pubs. The decision about when to reopen society, when to lift the lockdown, should also be down to the workers who are dealing with it to decide sort of democratically between ourselves. And I think that really opens up the question about what sort of society do we want going forward and coming out of this, because we can't go back to the way things were. The way things were laid the basis for this pandemic. The way things were meant that we weren't prepared to deal with the outbreak in the first place. So I think there's some immediate concrete things that trade unions need to start fighting for on behalf of the living. But actually, I don't think it's just a matter of, okay, get the PPE, get the testing, wait for this all to blow over. When this is over, I think we've got to ask ourselves some very profound questions about who it is that really runs society, who it is that we really need in society, and whose image do we want society to be built in. And I don't think it's going to be the banks, the landlords, and the bosses of Wetherspoons. I think it's going to be the nurses, the postal workers, and the supermarket checkout staff. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Jackie. That's a very comprehensive breakdown of how we need to run society.
Do you think that there are parallels between the way that the nurses are portrayed in the media today, either as angels or as feckless people going off doing dancing and videos when they shouldn't be, and the way that the match women were represented in the press first as these waifs and then as these harridans, and then turned into saints. Because one of the things that we're picking up really is nurses don't want to be portrayed as angels, they want the PPE. So perhaps that's the question to both of you.
That is such a good question, Sue, and it's absolutely true. With the match girls, you were either a good, poor little match girl, really. Think of the Hans Christian Andersen tale. And in the Hans Christian Andersen tale, the little match girl starves to death because she's so badly treated and so poor. But she's an angel. She goes up to heaven with her grandmother, and she's saintly and she's saved, and it's wonderful. No talk of trade unions from the little match girl. And that is exactly how the Victorians liked it, and I would argue how we like our working people now. And the Victorians were happy with them when they were poor little match girls, which is another reason we like to think they were led by Annie Besant, because that's less scary, a Lady Bountiful leading these little girlies, much less scary than a load of really revolutionary, really political, working class women, which is what they actually were. And we're seeing exactly the same thing now. Yes, you're completely right. As nurses are rightly saying, we don't want to be angels. Angels are dead. You're saying we're angels because that makes it okay if we die. But as soon as they start to, do anything that looks like they're talking about workers' rights, we see the right-wing press come steaming in and saying they're reporting again. And as someone I follow said on Twitter, oh good, normal services resumed, now we're useless again. That's good. It's been a bit shocking that we've actually been appreciated for a few weeks. We didn't know what to do with ourselves. And another reason that they're doing this, of course, is the business case. It's embarrassing for the Tories that they've been selling off and stitching up and cashing in on the NHS. And now suddenly everyone's going, the NHS is wonderful. Oh, God, that is really awkward, isn't it? So what do we do about that? How do we manage that? Well, we do our little clapping, but we also get ready to continue with the sell-off, which is exactly what they want to do, by saying, and we saw this in the Telegraph, Charles Moore was first in the Telegraph. Charles Moore used to be Boris Johnson's boss, no coincidence. So they come in for the state, preparing the ground, going, oh, actually, the NHS is too big. And it's the lumbering, huge NHS, no one knows where that NHS is, that's caused the lockdown. So he started blaming them for the lockdown. And then we've had the Mail saying, oh my goodness, they're dancing. So yes, they're going to, and then we've had Matt Hancock, let's not forget, saying they're wasting PPE. So yes, that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to start trying to blame these poor nurses who are going out there and dying, and blaming the state of the NHS so they can say, oh, you know what, we really just need to sell the rest of it off to dear old Richard Branson and then everything will be fine. And we've always seen working class people portrayed like this. They're all right if they're victims starving quietly, but as soon as they don't want to do that, they're terrible, dangerous rebels and wreckers who are a danger to the country. Yeah, absolutely nothing changes, unfortunately.
We're fashionable at the moment. Like for some reason, healthcare workers, everybody wants to have a healthcare worker endorse their products. Everyone wants to be associated with like the NHS effort. Like we've never been so popular. We're getting offers for loads of discounts for shops which are shut, and we're being told, that you have 10% off at Morrison's, which is cool. And if you die at work, then someone will get 60 grand, which is 2-3 years wages. And I think really it's all about just sort of like trying to placate healthcare workers who are rightly absolutely fuming. We're facing a situation where I'm amazed that it's only 140 odd people that have died so far. And I think that's probably because the true number is underreported. And actually, if you look at the trajectory of the virus in Italy, it was the healthcare workers represented a second wave in the crisis, because basically they're younger, they're healthier, they compensate for a lot longer. So we're talking about the NHS has coped. We could be in for a second spike, which is actually much younger, much healthier, and much more key workery than the previous fight. And you know, the government's whole like communication strategy around the virus has been to whip up this sense that this is a national emergency, and the people who are on the front line of it are our heroes, as though we're some kind of like conscript army. But calling us heroes just makes it okay when we die, because it's like, oh well, you know, they fell in the fight against coronavirus. Coronavirus is a virus. Coronavirus is not like it's not like a foreign army that you can just fight off if you've got, you know, like big guns. You know, it requires a social response. It requires a healthcare response, which has been woefully inadequate from our political leaders, unfortunately. So, you know, calling us heroes really just like mythologizes us and makes them into battle commanders, which they're not, and makes us into humble foot soldiers, which again we're not. And it will be, again, as people have said, something that will be used against us if we demand more. If we say, do you know what, I'm not happy with £60,000 death in service payment, I'd rather be alive. You know, say, do you know what, I'm not happy with earning sort of 12, 13, 14 pounds an hour to keep people on life support going through the middle of the night in, night out. I think I'm entitled to more than this. And then we'll see, then we'll go from being sort of heroes to traitors, angels to devils. But, you know, it happens to us all, doesn't it? And, you know, the right-wing press have done it to firefighters, and they've done it to Liverpool Football Club fans. They'll do it to anybody that threatens their power and their system in any kind of meaningful way. So can't please them all, can you?
I'm sorry to sort of pick your brains here, but I'm often contacted on Twitter by nurses who are absolutely desperate, and it's so difficult to know how to advise them. One young woman I know that today, as we speak, is working in a hospital with a cracked visor, completely cracked, and reused single-use PPE that, as you know, can't be properly cleaned. She has also had her pay docked for self-isolating, even though she self-isolated exactly in accordance with instructions. And I've got lots of other examples of nurses I could talk about in just these awful, awful conditions. But it's so difficult to know how to advise them. Obviously, I say, well, contact your union, but unions, as you know, it depends whether you've got a really good, really active local rep, doesn't it? And whether that rep's not off sick, and whether they do get back to you because they need responses urgently. They feel bad about, and obviously I would say, well, walk out, or threaten to walk out. But it's easy for me to say, isn't it? They're being threatened with the sack, as you know. They're being intimidated. They're even having their WhatsApp groups interfered with by management, saying you can't even talk to each other on WhatsApp. If you talk to the press, we will sack you. I just feel desperate for them. They're exposing this woman is out there being exposed to this right now. As far as I know, right this minute, she could be being infected because of this cracked visor. She's coming home from work and crying. She doesn't know how to pay her rent because her wages have been stopped for isolating. And often nurses are really conscientious people, aren't they? They don't feel like they can threaten to walk out. It's the only thing they can do. It's what they should do. But if their colleagues don't want to do it, they don't want to let their colleagues down. They don't want to let the patients down. It's really difficult for you to advise, I know. But what do I say to her? What can I advise her to do?
Okay, I'm waiting for someone to go, yeah, but then they're all muted, so they're not going to go. The first thing that she should do, which I'm sure she's done, I'm sure you've already advised her, but just for the benefit of anybody who's watching, escalate it to your line manager, escalate it to their line manager, escalate it to your employee. I think most employers have got a designated person who is responsible for PPE on each site, and it might not always be the same person, but there should be a PPE steward on every site within NHS in England. So escalate, escalate, escalate. You cannot escalate this too high, because the further you escalate it, the more concerned senior people there are. Essentially, what you've got to do is scream your lungs out to whoever will listen, and the higher the better, because if they know that you don't have PPE, then for the fact that you don't have PPE. So that's the first thing. Escalate it as high as you possibly can. Don't feel embarrassed if your senior's senior is not getting back to you, to go to your senior's senior. At the end of the day, this is your health and safety, your life, but also your colleagues' lives, because if you get it, you're going to pass it on to them and the people you're looking after, and the people who you would be looking after next week after, or 6 months down the line. The second thing, which I'm sure again you've advised her, would be to contact her trade union. If she's not a member of a trade union, join a trade union. I'm a member of Unison, but I'm not about to get into a fetish about which unions are best. It really does depend on your local circumstances and what your local rep's like. If she doesn't have a local rep, escalate again within the union. Contact further and further up within the union. Most unions have got, in fact, I think all unions have got like a call centre, direct line call centre. So if you're not getting any joy with your local rep, contact your union's call centre and escalate through then, and keep going. And again, I wouldn't feel embarrassed about escalating it to Dave Prentice himself if you're not getting any joy further down the line, because actually, again, the more senior the trade union bosses know about this, the more responsible they are. Because people who are further up the pecking order in all walks of life, the further up you are, I think the less heat you're feeling at the moment, because it's not you that has to go in to a COVID trap with nothing but a napkin over your face. So escalate. When it comes to the issue about walking out, I would be very, very reluctant to advise anybody who doesn't have a trade union backing them to walk out on their job. The law does support people, does support workers in refusing to undertake a dangerous action. But it's much safer to refuse to undertake a dangerous action if you've got a collective of several 100,000 people standing behind you. So it's not a straightforward answer, I'm afraid, but that is kind of where we're at. And I think also anybody who's in that situation needs to talk to their colleagues as well, the other people that are in that situation where they're being pressured into going into places without adequate PPE, and saying, are you prepared to take this home to your loved ones? Are you prepared to take this home to your partner, to your children? Are you prepared to run the risk of you getting it? Because the thing is, in healthcare, we are trained to put ourselves last. The service is run on a hell of a lot of goodwill, but that goodwill is going to kill people ultimately, and it is going to prevent services from recovering, because if we're losing staff because they are sick or dead of coronavirus, then it's not just about today's shift or tonight's shift. It's about being able to provide those services in 6 months, 3 months, 2 weeks' time, even at this rate. On the issue about pay, she should be getting some pay. Now, the way that I think employers are doing it is it's counted as other leave. So if you're on self-isolation, then it's counted as other leave. So you won't get necessarily your full pay because a lot of healthcare workers work a lot of unsocial hours. So you get like your basic pay for that week, what your basic pay would have been for that week, but you wouldn't get unsocial hours on like nights that you haven't done or weekends that you haven't done. We used to get unsocial hours payments at all bands on sort of sick pay and other leave, but it was sacrificed a few years ago in order to get a 1% pay rise. So
thanks for that, Jackie. I believe you've actually got a question for Louise as well.
Louise, if the Match Girls were alive today, what advice do you think they would give healthcare workers at the moment?
Well, I think probably actually the exact advice that you've just given me, Jack. They would say use your numbers, and they would say don't be intimidated by the bosses. The bosses are always going to tell you you're powerless. They're always going to tell you you've got to work or we'll sack you. But you do what they do, which is use their collective power and their numbers. They may not have been high up the hierarchy and they may have been told they were powerless, but they understood solidarity and strength in numbers. And they'd say exactly the same, do exactly as we did. You know, get together, band together, stand against these people. It is not worth dying, you know. And they didn't sign an employment contract, didn't get the chance to, but I'm always saying to people who are health workers, you signed an employment contract, not a suicide pact. You know, it's just the sacrifices people were being expected to make then, dying so people could make profits selling matches, for God's sake. But they're expecting people to do it now as well, exactly the same. And as you say, 60 grand if you've been working 2 years, I think, as well, isn't it? It's only if you've been in 2 years NHS employment. 60 grand, I looked up an MP's salary, 80 grand a year, an MP's salary. And that's the basics. That's not without those whopping great expenses for your duck houses. That's not without all the emoluments that they get. So it's really nice to know, isn't it, what we're worth to them. An NHS worker is worth 60 grand in perpetuity for all your earnings that you would have earned. So you're worth about, 6/8 of an MP. It's lovely to know, isn't it? But yeah, we have to go back to basics, don't we? We have to do what workers did back then, which was get together and fight. We cannot wait for Sir Keir Starmer to get round to us, to come and rescue us. It isn't going to happen. It's going to have to come from the grassroots again. It's going to have to come from the trade unions again.
Do you think, this is the last question for Louise, do you think that the match women have been represented in Labour history as much as they have done in the official history? And if so, why?
Yeah, okay. The interesting thing, when I came to the story and wrote my book, available from all good booksellers when they're open again, or online, striking a light. The reason that I never expected to write a book, you know, I'd left school at 15, I wasn't an academic, I was never going to be the person who wrote a book, I was just a trade unionist doing some research. But when I came to it, I discovered the story that I'd heard, which was really covered in a few lines in Labour history, if it was dealt with at all, and it was just, oh, some girls went on strike, but it wasn't really that important. It was led by middle class socialists, it wasn't led by the workers themselves. I mean, gosh, they were only teenage Irish girls, what would they know? And the real action didn't start till the dock strike. The dock strike was where we trace our modern trade union movement to, and not the match women. Two problems with that. Firstly, well, I looked at it and thought, so if the matchmen went on strike first, why is that not the start of the movement? But people would say, oh, well, you know, you don't understand, not being a proper historian, you don't understand, that's not really the way it happened. The dockers' strike was much more important. So I looked at what the dockers said, and they said, oh, yeah, that was the match girls. That totally inspired us, of course, because they're EastEnders, we're EastEnders, they're Irish, we're Irish. They've got no employment rights, neither have we. You know, some of them are our wives and daughters and sisters and friends. Of course we're inspired by them, and we've seen what they did and we absolutely copied it. And I thought, well, that's so interesting. Why has that not come down in history? And the answer, I think, is that we prefer, the establishment certainly prefer, history to be great individuals. Kings and queens, preferably, is where all the action is. Don't tell the little people that actually they're the engines of change. Actually, they're the ones driving the forces of history, all that they can. Good God, no, don't tell them that. It's only kings and queens. The rest of you be quiet. If we can't find a king or a queen in a story, we at least find a middle class individual. And that's why Annie Besant got pushed into the frame as being the strike leader. She, by the way, said, I didn't lead the strike. It's a terrible idea that they went on strike. Socialists in those days, middle class socialists, didn't want rabble like this in their nice trade union movement, and they certainly didn't want them going on strike. So it's completely an attempt by, establishment history to say this was one woman, one Lady Bountiful, who led all these little match women who are just an amorphous mass. We don't need to know their names. We don't need to distinguish them as individuals. They're just the match girls, and they just did what they were told by the nice middle class lady, because that's not threatening. That's not a threatening version of history. But that 1400s, barely educated through no fault of their own, starving, poor, impoverished young women and girls from the East End back streets of London rose up together and started the modern trade union movement. Thank you to Jeremy Corbyn, who acknowledged that a couple of years ago and acknowledged my work in that respect. That's scary. We don't want that message out there, and that's exactly why we should be putting that message out there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Louise. Much appreciated. So I'm now going to go back to Steve, because I think he wanted to make a couple of points before we wrap up.
Right, okay. Yes, I think there is a very clear parallel between the match women and the Medway Norse guys. Largely disregarded, let's be honest. And that's really one of the reasons that the management are getting away with an absolutely outrageous refusal to give them any kind of safety whatsoever. And it's so obvious. If you watch the cabs, there are at least three guys, very, and they haven't got a choice. They have to sit very, very close together. Now, the management insists that there's no alternative. And you think, well, even if that's true, and it certainly isn't, you would expect them to give them masks. It's the obvious. It's absolutely obvious. But they're not doing it. In fact, you'll find both the council and Norse insist that they are following all the regulations and that they are following the government advice. And it's complete and utter nonsense. Utter nonsense. It is, quite frankly, callous complacency. They are saying quite clearly, it'll be fine, and the idea that somebody might die as a consequence doesn't enter into their head. They don't think it's possible. And I think in part because they think, these are just refuse collectors. These are just people at the bottom. They don't get that sort of thing. And it's the only explanation you can think of. And I think what is really quite important, how they managed to get away with all this. One of the most key questions, I think, is that when they're already talking about winding down the lockdown and getting people back to work, and we're being told that what's going to happen is that, of course, they'll have proper social distancing and they'll all have proper PPE. And quite frankly, I think that's for the birds. I don't think that is going to happen at all. I think, again, those where you've got the organisation, where you've got people who can make a good case and get the publicity, maybe that's the case. But lots of other workers won't get that. I remember back in the sort of 70s when I started out as a trade unionist, there was this sort of argument that, well, of course, back in the day, trade unions, there was a place for them because employers weren't very good. But employers are civilised now. We don't have those sorts of problems anymore. We've come on, we've progressed. And actually, the reality is, we know perfectly well, they haven't progressed. They're as vicious and will be as vicious as they possibly can be, because they're going to push for profit, and that's the end of it. And what we're facing, once the crisis is out the way, or even before it's out the way, we are facing what they're telling us is probably going to be the worst possible depression that anybody's had for 3 centuries. And under those circumstances, we are not going to get any support from the powers that be. Employers are they always talk about jobs when they mean profits, of course. They're very keen about jobs until they want to get rid of jobs, and they will be wanting to get rid of jobs. And the only thing that is going to defend workers is ourselves, is our collective organisation. And I think the message that everybody needs to take away is that the match women had to fight in 1888. Trade unions have always had to fight, and by God, we're going to have to fight for the future.
It's been a fascinating discussion, and thanks to everyone for their comments, thoughts, questions and solidarity. For me personally, it's shown that whilst we may all have different views on how we achieve a different, fairer, more equal and better world, we all share the same belief that it must happen, that it can happen, and if we keep fighting together, it will happen. I think I'm not being too presumptuous in saying it's been quite a success this evening, but more importantly, it has kept alive the tradition of Workers' Memorial Day, where our class stand collectively in solidarity to remember the dead and renew our vow to carry on fighting for the living. So thank you in particular to our key speakers, Kevin, who unfortunately disappeared from us, Louise, Jack, and latterly Chris, and also to the comrades who helped to make this happen, in particular Steve, Chaz and Ralph, for all your work. Before I go, I just want to leave you with a quote from a socialist political activist, songwriter, musician, singer and daytime washing machine repairman Joe Solo. One of my favourite poems that he actually wrote. He finished the poem with, "You ask me why I'm angry, I ask you why you're not."